What a haunting melody. It's called Nigun Althaus by Shlomo Katz. He talks about, it's on his album Live in Melbourne. And one time he just found it, back in the days when there were tapes. He found a tape in a secondhand shop. Somebody recorded it. He started listening to it. And it just got inside of him and wouldn't let go. And he was walking around listening to it, humming it, thinking about it for weeks. And then he performed it. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It is great to be with you. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we do some beautiful learning, drawing from a few different sources here on a Thursday night. Man, it's palpable. Shabbos is almost here. Thank God. Renee in Indy, Yehuda in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Paul in Chicago, Bill in Berkeley, Yosef in Lowell, Massachusetts, Jose in Miami Lakes, PK in Colorado, asking, is Sal here? I'm leaving on Sunday. and then coming back the following, and then I'll restart the show on the following Thursday. So I'll be here Saturday night through Saturday night, do the final show Saturday night before I leave. Then Sunday, probably, we'll have a firm announcement, but right now it's looking like Nina will do her Chofetz Chaim shows on Sunday and Monday, possibly Tuesday, we'll see. And then I'll be back on Thursday. So from Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, keep reading the daf on your own, the page of Talmud for the day. And then when I get back that following Thursday, I'll do highlights of those 4 days that I was away, plus the day that we're covering, a week from today. That's what's going on with the schedule. Okay, hold on. Let me finish. Who am I with here? Lucy in Minnesota, Sharon in New Jersey, Nancy in North Carolina, Paula loves the music. She's in the Great Northwest. Paul in Minneapolis, Stephen in New Hampshire, Ann in Merced. Tom says shalom. Folks greeting each other. Lynn in North Texas and Gigi in British Columbia. Welcome, everybody. Yesterday, there was a question about, since we're generally talking about here in chapter 2 of Tractate Yoma, and today's daf is page 25. We've been discussing the first Mishna. Today we'll also be covering the second Mishna of chapter 2 in Tractate Yoma, the 6th volume of the Talmud, the laws of Yom Kippur. And we've generally been talking about that during that 7 days that the high priest is sequestered in the temple compound as he prepares for his duties on Yom Kippur. That one of the things that happens is he gets trained in the duties that are normally performed by the other priests. He's going to have to do the majority of that on Yom Kippur. So a question came up yesterday about the daily offerings, the tamid, which is brought every day. And somebody asked about, the daily offering is a burnt offering. And so after that animal is slaughtered, they don't just, slaughter it and then pick up the whole animal and throw it onto the altar fire. They cut it up, they slaughter it, and then cut it up in pieces and bring it up in a series of pieces onto the altar fire. And the question yesterday, sorry, I don't remember who asked it, was about the order in which those pieces are brought. And I said, well, we'll be covering that when we get to, really studying these offerings in greater detail later in our journey, specifically in Tractate Tamid. But on today's page, we are going to be talking somewhat about those offerings, and as we'll see, as is so often the case, there was a dispute among the sages about how it was actually done and what the order should be. And then they don't really talk about what we learned from it, but I'm going to. Perhaps some lesson that we could take from the order of the pieces that were brought up onto the altar. Vis-a-vis this, let me just introduce, and I'll show what the link is later, but I'm just taking another little piece of wisdom from the Rabbi Joseph Telushkin book, and it's really about the power of words. Now, Nina, when I'm away, certainly Sunday, Monday, she's going to be teaching teachings of the Chofetz Chaim, who really, wrote the definitive Jewish text on what is permitted to say and what is prohibited to say, the laws of speech, of good speech, and avoiding bad speech, wicked speech. The lips are so powerful. The mind is certainly, the heart, you could say, is the most powerful organ in the body. It keeps the blood pumping, keeps us alive. But in terms of the power of the human on other people, on its environment, you'd have to say the brain is probably the most powerful organ. But in terms of the danger that the human poses to others, you'd have to look at the lips. The lips are, let's say, the gatekeepers of the thoughts conceived by the brain, but it's really what you say. It can be said in a lot of different ways. Certainly there's the old phrase, the pen is mightier than the sword. And apropos of this idea of the power of speech and how powerful it is when it's wielded for good and how powerful it can be when it is wielded for wickedness. So Rabbi Telushkin mentions that the Chofetz Chaim, the rabbinic sage who wrote the standard Jewish text on the laws against gossip, once commented to a man who was speaking ill of others, "There are people in the adjoining room preparing a telegram. Notice how carefully they consider each word before they put it down. That's how careful we should be when we speak." Now, for Rabbi Telushkin, the Chofetz Chaim's words bring to mind a late 19th century Rebbe, so from the late 1800s, a Rebbe who told his followers, everything that has been created in God's world has a lesson to teach us. I often say something similar, that God is speaking to us constantly in the language of events. It's a language that could just, flow right past our eyes and our ears if we don't tune in and pay attention. Thinking that the Rebbe was engaging in hyperbole, that everything teaches a lesson, one of his followers called out, "And what can we learn from the train?" Well, the Rebbe answered that because of being 1 minute late, you can lose everything. "And what can we learn from the telegraph?" "That for every word you pay." "And what about the telephone?" which must have been a very new invention in the late 1800s. And the Rebbe answered that what we say here is heard there. That's very important. Right? There's also that old story of somebody who gossiped and slandered against another, did terrible, terrible harm, went to apologize, and then, in trying to make amends, he was told, well, apologizing for slandering another person, it's like taking a feather pillow and releasing the feathers in the wind, and then says you want to make up for it, and he says to you, okay, go pick up all the feathers that's scattered in the wind. It's impossible. So words that you issue, once they leave your lips, they're out in the world. They can't be taken back. You can apologize with all your heart, but you can't undo the harm. That's how powerful the lips are. We're going to be coming back to that later in today's page. Let me mention at this point that we are in a campaign leading up to Shavuos. We're trying to up the number of monthly donors that we have. It helps us regulate our budget over the year. When you support Accidental Talmudist, you support sharing Torah with the world. It's a tremendous merit. It's one that you can take with you when you leave this world. Just go to donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Any amount that comes in on a monthly basis is wonderful. And if you sign up for $18 a month, you can dedicate an episode of AT Daily to the honor or the healing or the memory of a loved one. And we hope that you'll join us in that important mitzvah of sharing Torah with the world. Nina will put that link in the comments. Again, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Okay. Now we're going to start at the bottom of the B side of page 24. And the Gemara asks, with what garments were the priests clothed when they held the lottery? Recall that here in this chapter, we're learning that there were 4 lotteries held every day in the temple to assign the various duties that the priests who were serving in the temple on that day would get. And there were usually more priests than there were elements of the divine service available, and that's why they had this lottery. Initially, there were contests among the priests, particularly to sweep the ashes off the altar, and they had a running race, and it led to, a broken leg in one instance and a murder most foul in another, and the sages said, okay, we're going to do this by lottery, much safer system. Okay, so then the question is, how do they do the lottery? And the question that's being asked right here is, what were the priests wearing when they conducted the lottery to see who would participate in that day's avodah, the divine service? And you think, what difference does it make what they wear? But you can't say what difference does it make, because the clothes of the Kohanim were specifically described in the Torah. There were 4 garments that every priest wore and 8 garments that the high priest wore and that distinguished him. And they were specifically spelled out what those garments should be, and they were created and maintained and guarded and cleaned with tremendous care. So really the question is, are the priests ready to serve? Are they dressed and ready to go when they're participating in the lottery or not? I titled today's show, the Apparel Oft Proclaims the Man. Now, that, if you might recognize, is a line from Shakespeare, from Hamlet, spoken by Polonius. Polonius, in that play, is somewhat of a smart-sounding, foolish man. But when his son Laertes is going to study abroad, he gives him a whole bunch of little packets of wisdom to take with him. And it's a wonderful collection of wisdom, which includes this idea that what you wear is very often how people see you. And I just thought it would actually be worthwhile to hear what else Polonius advises Laertes. I mean, this is a Jewish wisdom class. I'm going to be coming back to, this idea, a couple of ideas about speech, and another one here from Rabbi Tolushkin that I didn't mention yet, about the power of our words, right? And before I mention that one, I just wanted to say, hear what Shakespeare put in Polonius's mouth. So he says, give thy thoughts no tongue. Keep your mouth shut. Nor any unproportioned thought his act. Be thou familiar, right? Be friendly, but by no means vulgar. The friends thou hast, and their adoption tried, grapple them to thy soul with hoops of steel. The sages advise the same. Acquire for yourself a friend, and then nurture that friendship. But do not dull thy palm with entertainment of each new-hatched, unfledged comrade. Right? Don't just because somebody has a nice word to say to you and sounds like a good guy, bon vivant, don't attach yourself to every person who seems to be entertainment. You'll be brought low quickly. Beware of entrance to a quarrel. Avoid quarrel, peace in above all things. But being in, bear it that the opposed may beware of thee. Right? Avoid quarrel. But if somehow you're dragged into a quarrel, bring your A game and make it so that the other people regret they got into a quarrel with you. Give every man thine ear, but few thy voice. Listen, be a listener. You have 2 ears, 1 mouth. Take each man's censure, but reserve thy judgment. Right? Listen to the criticisms, to the rebukes of everybody. It doesn't mean you have to accept what they've said, but listen to it. And be very stingy with your rebuke of others. Make sure that you have something important to say before you rebuke anyone. Costly thy habit as thy purse can buy, but not expressed in fancy. Rich, not gaudy, for the apparel oft proclaims the man. And they in France of the best rank and station are most select and generous in that. Neither a borrower nor a lender be, for loan oft loses both itself and friend, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. And this above all, to thine own self be true. And it must follow, as the night the day, thou canst not be false to any other man. So we have several, in that long list of really quite wise adages, several times he mentions measure your speak, keep your thoughts to yourself, don't be quick to criticize others, that lips have to be the gatekeepers of your thoughts. And on this subject, just as we can learn from Shakespeare, we can learn from a somewhat controversial book called The Wisdom of Ben Sira, sometimes known as Ecclesiasticus. It's part of those books called the Apocrypha in this culture. But for the sages, the Wisdom of Ben Sira was a well-known book, and they had mixed feelings about it. Right? It was one of those books that was sort of a candidate to be included in the Bible. It did not get included in the Bible. And so some of the sages said it should just be avoided because it sort of leads to the reading of other works, and that could lead to Greek philosophy, and above all, avoid that as far as the sages were concerned. But nevertheless, I mean, it was written by a Jew, and it has tremendously wise things in it. And here Rabbi Joseph Telushkin is bringing down a very short piece from it. And he says, "Have you heard something? Let it die with you. Be of good courage. It will not burst you." And I love that idea. You know, sometimes we're just so bursting to share something we've heard with others. It's just, tearing, like money tears a hole in your pocket. Those words are like tearing a hole in your lips. But be of good courage. It will not burst you. You can do it. You can keep it to yourself. All right. So the Gemara asked, with what garments were the priests clothed when they held the were the priests clothed when they held the lottery? And Rav Nachman said the priests were clothed in their own non-sacred garments, right? They were dressed in their street clothes when they held the lotteries. But Rav Sheishes said the priests were dressed in their priestly sacred garments. So Rav Nachman says when they held these lotteries, they went in their street clothes. And Rav Sheishes says, no, they wore their priestly garb at the time of the lottery. So the Gemara explains the two approaches. Rav Nachman said the priests were dressed in their non-sacred garments because if you say the lottery was to be held when they were dressed in their sacred garments, if they were already dressed in their sacred clothes, well, there were strong-armed men among the priests who might act with force and perform the service even if they did not win the lottery. Since they were already wearing the sacred garments, they would simply force their way into performing the service, right? So they wouldn't accept that they lost the lottery, and since they're dressed and ready to go, they might just run out there and perform the service so that they would just get it done. Rav Sheishes said they were wearing sacred garments, as if you say they wore their non-sacred garments due to the fact that the service was so beloved to them. Well, they're in their excitement over having been granted the privilege. So before it was the problem, the guys who lost the lottery. But according to Rav Sheishes, if you're saying that they're so in love with doing the service, well, what about the guys who won the lottery? Now that they won, they might rush out and perform the service. But if they're not wearing their priestly garb, then whatever service they perform is disqualified because they were dressed wrong. A priest who brings an offering on the altar while not dressed in the priestly garments disqualifies the offering. So according to Rav Sheishes, you want them to be dressed in their garb. According to Rav Nachman, you don't want them to be dressed in their garb because the ones who lose might just go out there and get it done. Rav Sheishes says we don't want them. We want them dressed in their priestly garb because the ones who win the lottery might run out there and they need to be dressed. Rav Nachman said, "From where do I state my opinion? As we learned in the Mishna, after the lottery, they gave the priests over to the attendants. And the attendants would take their clothes off them, and they would leave only their trousers on them." What? Is it not talking about those priests who won the lottery, describing how their non-sacred garments were removed from them before they were dressed in the priestly garments? And Rav Huna Bar Yehuda said that Rav Sheishes said, rejecting that interpretation, no, it is possible to explain that all the priests at the lottery were wearing the sacred garments, and that, on the contrary, the Mishnah speaks about those priests who did not win the lottery. And the text describes how the sacred garments that they wore during the lottery were removed from them by those attendants. And the Gemara supports this latter interpretation of Rav Sheishes, who says that they were wearing the priestly garments during the lottery. So too, it is reasonable to follow Rav Sheishes's interpretation of the Mishnah, as if it were to enter your mind to say that the Mishnah is dealing with those who won the lottery and describes how their non-sacred garments were removed and sacred garments put on, well then how would one understand the statement in the Mishnah, they would leave only their trousers on them? One would have to explain that the priests subsequently donned the holy clothes on top of the non-sacred trousers, and then they would remove the non-sacred trousers and replace them with the sacred trousers. But wasn't it taught in a baraisa? From where is it derived that nothing should precede the trousers when the priest dresses? Meaning the first thing he has to put on of the priestly garments is the trousers. Now, it's unclear whether he's taken off everything else, but the first of the priestly garments has to be the trousers. And the verse states in Leviticus 16:4, "And he shall have linen trousers upon his flesh." However, according to the proposed interpretation of the Mishnah, the priests donned the other sacred garments and put on the trousers after them, and that would violate this idea that you put the trousers on first. And the Gemara asks, and how would the other one, meaning Rav Nachman, resolve this difficulty? Well, he could respond that this is not difficult, as this is what the Mishnah is teaching. While the non-sacred garments are still on them, they put the sacred trousers on, and then they remove the non-sacred clothes, so leaving them wearing only the sacred trousers, and then they put on the rest of the priestly garb. Therefore, it is possible to interpret the Mishnah either way. We don't have a proof yet of whether they wore the priestly garb during the lottery, according to the interpretation of Rav Sheishes, or whether they wore non-sacred street clothes, according to the interpretation of Rav Nachman. Rav Sheishes said, "From where do I say that the priests wore sacred garments when the lottery was held? As it was taught in a baraisa, the Chamber of Hewnstone, that's the room in the temple compound where the Sanhedrin met, and specifically when new priests were examined to see if they were fit for service in the temple, this is where they came before the Sanhedrin. The Chamber of Hewnstone was built in the style of a large basilica. Interesting word here, from the Greek basilike, meaning a rectangle. And the lottery is held in the east of the chamber, and an elder of the court sits in the west to provide instruction and adjudicate any doubtful cases. And the priests stand in a circle in the shape of a bracelet, and the appointed priest comes and removes the mitre, M-I-T-R-E, so that's the headpiece that the priests wore, and removes the mitre from the head of one of them, And everyone thereby knew that the count began from him. Remember, the way the lottery is done is that they all gather around and then they count them. And I don't know who chooses the number that they count to, but whoever ends up on that number, that's the priest chosen by the lottery. And they all need to remember where it started. So they take the cap off the priest who is the number one in this counting. And everyone thereby knew that the count began with him. Now, if it were to enter your mind to say that the priests wore non-sacred garments during the lottery, is there such a thing as a mitre among one's non-sacred garments? This shows that the priests were wearing their sacred garments when the lottery took place. But the Gemara rejects this reasoning. Yes, indeed, there is such a thing as a mitre that one wears as non-sacred apparel. As Rav Yehuda, and some say it was Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, taught, a priest whose mother made a tunic for him to show her love for her son and her love for mitzvahs may perform an individual service with it on, but not communal services. So what we have here is that a priest might have a private uniform, as it were. It is the priestly garb. It's styled like the priestly garb, but it wasn't made by the special, contractor that had the deal to create the garb of the priest. Rather, his own mother made it. She followed the specifications of the Torah, and they knew what the priestly garb looked like, but it wasn't an official uniform. So we have this halacha, this law, that a priest could wear that uniform that looks like the uniform, even though it's not the official uniform, if he was officiating in the temple and bringing an offering from a private individual. But when it comes to the communal offerings on behalf of the whole nation, no, he has to wear the official priestly garb made by the holy temple outfitters, as it were. Therefore, it is possible that the priests had non-sacred mitres in the style of the sacred mitres, just as they sometimes had non-sacred tunics. Now, apropos of the Baraisa, I'm skipping that. Okay. And if it were to enter your mind to say the opposite, that the chamber stood entirely in the non-sacred area. Oh, wait a minute, I should read that. Apropos of the Baraisa that was just cited, Abaye said, conclude from this Baraisa that the Chamber of Hewnstone was half in the sacred area within the consecrated temple grounds and half in the non-sacred part of the temple grounds. Right? So we're taking just a little bit of digression there. Now that we're talking about what they were wearing, and we brought a proof. Rav Sheishes brings a proof from this idea that since they removed the mitre, it must be that they were wearing sacred clothes. And we saw that there was an argument against that. But in bringing that Baraisa, now the sages speculate a little bit about what about this room, the Chamber of Hewnstone, where there was an elder of the Sanhedrin and the lottery was being done of the priests. Remember that the elder of the Sanhedrin is not a priest. He can't enter the sacred areas of the temple. So how does this Chamber of Hewn Stone actually work? So apropos of this, Abaye said, conclude from this Baraisa that the Chamber of Hewn Stone was built half in the sacred area within the consecrated temple grounds and half in the non-sacred part of the temple grounds. And conclude from it as well that the chamber had two doorways, one that opened to the sacred area of the temple and one that opened to the non-sacred area. And Abaye explains these inferences. As it were to enter your mind that the Chamber of Hewn Stone stood entirely in the sacred area, how could one say that the elder sat in its west? Didn't the master say there is no sitting allowed in the temple courtyard for non-priests, maybe for anybody, except for kings of the house of David alone? And the elder must therefore have been sitting in an area external of the temple courtyard area. And if it were to enter your mind to say the opposite, that the chamber stood entirely in the non-sacred area, how could the lottery be held in the east? Aren't we required to fulfill the verse, in the house of God we walked with the throng, Psalm 55, from where it was derived earlier that it is desirable that the lotteries cause a commotion. That's what we talked about yesterday, in the house of God, i.e. in the sacred area of the temple. If the lottery were held in a non-sacred area, there would not be fulfillment of this verse. So rather, one must conclude from this baraisa that the chamber was situated half in the sacred area of the temple and half in the non-sacred area. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 2. But just to make a conclusion about what they wore, did we get a conclusion? So which way was it? Did they wear the sacred garments or not? With what garments were the priests clothed when they held the lottery? During the lottery, the priests wore their priestly garments. The Rambam rules in accordance with the opinion of Rav Sheishes because of the principle that the law, the halacha, is ruled in accordance with the opinion of Rav Sheishes in his debates with Rav Nachman. So, there you go. Now we know. Now we come to Mishnah number 2, and this is why I was talking about those laws of speech earlier. The Mishnah is like this. The second lottery conducted daily among the priests determines the following: who slaughters the morning offering, who sprinkles its blood, who removes the ashes from the inner altar. The inner altar, right? So we've already talked about removing the ashes from the outer altar where all the offerings were brought, but there's also the inner altar, which is inside the sanctuary. So who removes the ashes from the inner altar, and who removes the ashes and the burnt wicks from the menorah, from the candelabrum, and who takes the limbs of the daily offering up to the ramp to be burned later. Now, this is how the limbs of the daily offerings, which are burnt offerings, meaning elevation offerings that the animal completely is burned up on the altar. This is how the limbs were divided before taking them up to the altar. The head, so this is that question that came yesterday, the order of the pieces of the animal that were brought up on the altar. So the head and the right leg were carried by one priest, and the two forelegs were carried by a second priest. The head and the right hind leg were carried by one priest, and then the two front legs were carried by a second priest. The tail, which included the lower vertebrae of the spinal column and the fat tail, and the left leg were carried by a third priest, and the breast and the throat and some of the inner organs attached to it were carried by a fourth priest, and the two flanks were taken by a fifth priest, and the intestines by a sixth priest. And the fine flour of the meal offering accompanying the daily offering was carried by a seventh priest, and the high priest's daily griddle cake offering was carried by an eighth priest. And the wine for the libation was carried by a ninth. Altogether, 13 priests prevailed in this lottery. 9 priests who carried the daily offering and its accompanying elements, and 4 who performed the slaughter, the sprinkling, and the removal of ashes from the inner altar and the candelabrum. Ben Azai said before Rabbi Akiva, in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua, that was not the sequence of taking the limbs up to the ramp. Rather, the order in which it was sacrificed was according to the way the animal walked when it was alive, as will be explained in the Gemara. That's the Mishnah. The Gemara. A dilemma was raised before the sages. When the priests performed the lottery, did they perform a lottery for just one service, such as the slaughtering, and the other 12 tasks were divided among the priests who happened to be standing next to the chosen one? Or perhaps they performed a separate lottery for each and every service of the 13 acts listed? And the Gemara answers, come and hear a proof from that which was taught in the Mishnah. There were 4 lotteries there. And if it were to enter your mind that they performed a lottery for each and every service separately, well, then there would be many more than 4 lotteries. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, that is not a conclusive proof, because one could argue that this is what the Mishnah is saying. The priests gathered 4 times a day for a lottery, but in each gathering there could be many lotteries. Come and hear a proof from what Rabbi Hiya taught explicitly in a baraisa. a lottery is not held for each individual service. Rather, beginning with the priest who won the lottery of the daily offering, 12 of his fellow priests, those who happen to be standing next to him, are drawn in along with him to perform the other acts of the daily offering. And the Gemara concludes, learn from it that this is so. We skip down a little bit toward the end of the B-side of page 25. The Mishna, and I'm almost done, so if you've got questions and comments, get them in. The Mishna states that Ben Azai said before Rabbi Akiva, in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua, that the sequence for carrying up the animal's limbs was based on the way it walks when it was alive, meaning that its front parts are taken up first. And the sages taught in a Tosefta, in what manner is the animal brought up according to the way it walks? It is in this manner. First the head and the right hind leg are brought up first, right? So maybe the way that these animals walk, I'm not sure if it's a sheep or a goat, but it's like the head and the hind leg actually move first. It's funny because we were watching the Dodgers game last night, and they were talking about the way that a base runner takes a lead. And an expert base runner, a really great base runner, doesn't start with the foot that's closest to second base. He starts with the foot that's further away, as that sets him up for the next and most explosive step, right? So an animal actually moves its hind leg first when it's going to be going in whatever direction. And that's the way that according to this, the head and the right hind leg are brought up first. The other parts follow this sequence. The breast and the neck, and then the two forelegs, and then the two flanks, the tail, and the left hind leg. Rabbi Yosei says it was sacrificed according to the way that it was skinned. In what manner was it brought up according to the way that it was skinned? That would be the head and the right leg first, then the tail and the left leg, then the two flanks, then the two forelegs, then the breast and the neck. Rabbi Akiva has yet another interpretation. It's brought up according to the way, it was sacrificed according to the way that it was cut up, the way that it was butchered, as it were. In what manner is the animal brought up according to the way it was cut up? First the head and the right leg, then the two forelegs, then the breast and the neck, then the two flanks, and then the tail and the left leg. Rabbi Yosei HaGalili says it was sacrificed according to the quality of its various sections, so that the best pieces were taken up first. In what manner is the animal brought up according to the quality of the pieces? First the head and the right leg, then the breast and the neck, and then the two flanks and the tail of the left leg. So they have a bunch of different suggestions of how the different pieces were brought up. And I'm not even sure that we get a definitive answer of which order it was brought. What they all agree on is that the head and the rearmost leg come first, right? So it's like, so the head for sure is coming first, and then that leg, which is the first part to act in the animal when it's going to take action. But for sure, the head goes first. And what I wanted to say about that, right, because the heart comes next, right? So in no case does the heart precede the head. In drawing, what is a sacrifice? It's a korban, right? It's something that is being brought near to the Holy One, right? It's an offering that goes up in smoke as a pleasing aroma to the Holy One. And the head will always precede the heart. So that made me think of a saying that is related to that, which is Proverbs 15:7, in which it says, "The lips of the wise crown knowledge, the heart of fools is not so." Now, this is an interesting saying, right? This is from Mishle. These are sayings of King Solomon, who we take as the wisest man who ever lived. And he says, the lips of the wise crown knowledge, the heart of fools is not so. Now, you might have expected him to say that the lips of the wise crown knowledge, the lips of fools are not so. How is it that he's making a comparison between the lips of the wise and the hearts of fools? Usually we talk about, the wise ones are silent. They can keep their mouths shut. and the fools go blah, 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 right? But here we're talking about the lips of the wise and the hearts of fools. And what I think Solomon is trying to tell us here is that as go our thoughts and then our words, so follow our hearts. If we're given to speaking gossip, to speaking slander, to talking about idle matters, to just using our power of speech for blah, blah, then our hearts will follow and never really become wise. Now, remember that the Torah often speaks about wise-hearted people, right? So there, the Torah actually understood that the mind and the heart were kind of synonymous, right? That there was a kind of wisdom that is in your heart, that the seat of thought was in the heart. But but the gate to all of that is the lips, right? So I think that when we talk, something we can learn, this is just me, I don't have a source for this, but I think what we can learn is that for sure the head is always going to go up on the altar first. The head is going to be brought near to God first. And it's almost like, well, if the head focused on God, if you focus your thoughts on God, well, then the heart's going to follow in that direction. And so the head is going to receive a reward for bringing the body with it, aspiring to rise to a higher place. The more we talk about, the more we focus, the more we enroll others in our aspirations to live lives of truth and holiness. So the more we're going to conduct ourselves that way, and the more we'll grow in wisdom, and the more we'll become that person that we're aspiring to become. On the other hand, if we just give vent to any thought that passes between our ears and everything comes out of our lips with no discretion, there's no gatekeeper, then that's the kind of person that we're going to become. And in that case, the head should go up in smoke first, right? So it's like either the head is brought up on the altar as a reward and it goes first because it spoke wisdom, it tried to speak wisdom all its life and the heart followed, or the head is brought up first to shut it up first. Right? It's like because wherever the lips go, the body will follow, whether it's for good or for bad. If it's for good, to a reward. If it's for bad, to punishment. But that head is going to go first. So it's such an important lesson to guard your speech. Guard your speech. And Nina will be talking about that, I'm sure, with greater wisdom than I'm applying here, because she's going to be teaching lessons of the Chofetz Chaim in her class at the regular time this Sunday and Monday. You definitely want to tune in for that. Okay. The Gemara explains the reason behind the order of the pieces in the Mishnah. Rava said both the Tan of our Mishnah and Rabbi Yosef HaGalili agree that we follow the relative quality of the meat in the various pieces. The difference in opinion between them is that one sage, the Tan of the Mishnah, follows the limb, i.e. the amount of the meat, and the other sage, Rabbi Yosef, follows the fattiness of the meat. So it's more of a technical reason which parts are brought up first. I was looking for that kind of, that inner, the soul of the teaching, the inner Torah. And that's why I say, I think, since in all opinions agree that the head goes first to the altar, in this case, I think it's talking about that power of speech, which is expressed through the lips, which just lead the body around all of our lives. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. I think Nina had to go pick up Avi from baseball practice, so let me see. Okay, I'll be scanning for the questions myself. Okay. Carolyn is agreeing with me. Interesting, there is a saying, that which is always on the tip of one's tongue is what one loves most. This is a cautionary tale. Beautiful. Thank you. You said it much more succinctly than I did. Very, very good. Sharon, I know that this is a modern sensibility, but I find the animal sacrifices minutiae, in other words, going into detail on how they're slaughtered and how they're brought, she finds it disturbing. Such a wasteful loss of lives. I really strive to understand, but it remains troubling to me. I do a lot of animal rescues, so perhaps that is the source of my discomfort. And there's different opinions on this. I believe the Rambam said that was a world steeped in animal sacrifice. It was just the normal mode of expression. Nobody was squeamish about animals. Because they all, they all grew up around animals, and they would slaughter it themselves to eat dinner, etc. They were comfortable with that. The sacrifice aspect of it is that, like most people were poor, and to own an animal and then to, instead of eating it, give it up as an offering, it was a tremendous sacrifice. But according to the Rambam, so the laws of animal sacrifice that we practice in the temple, and which ended when the temple was destroyed, was needed in that time and place. But since the world has evolved, we don't need animal sacrifices in order to get close to God. And so according to that opinion, perhaps even when Mashiach comes and the third temple is rebuilt, the animal sacrifices won't be restored. The opposing opinion to that is that when the temple is restored, the sacrifices will begin again, so that we'll be finally able to fulfill all these laws that we were not capable of fulfilling in the last 2,000 years. However, even if that second opinion is true, along with it, we'll see that the world will be as filled with knowledge of the divine as water fills the sea. So whenever mitzvahs are going to be conducted in that messianic world, the sort of inner element of every commandment that we're fulfilling is also going to be revealed, right? And it'll almost be like, I don't think that the animals will be suffering. It's almost like the souls will be in both places at once. Animals have a soul. So the animal soul, will sort of be present alongside the animal if it's being brought. Just as all the humans who ever lived, they will be resurrected now into their bodies. But we're going to understand why there's been so much physical suffering. It's not just animals were sacrificed. So many humans, I'm not talking about human sacrifice, but so many humans have been tortured, killed. Man, unimaginable suffering these last thousands of years that we cannot understand. Most recently, we can't understand why 45 souls were taken at the celebrations in Mount Meron. But in that age, we'll be able to understand those things. So Sharon, I say to you, you're entitled. You're 100% entitled to feel uncomfortable with that because it's something we don't understand. However, what we strive to do is to have faith in God's wisdom. If He commanded it, there is a reason, and it's a good reason. We just may not be able to understand it yet, like so many other things we don't understand. Right, so there's a discussion about the mitre and the tzitz. The tzitz was only on the high priest's forehead, but every priest had a cap, right? So the four garments of every priest were the trousers, the tunic, the mitre, and the belt. That's what every priest had. And then to the high priest, we add the breastplate, the ephod, the special. I'm not going to get into the priest garments right now. I'm not prepared to speak about that. But the idea when we brought up the mitre was if they use the mitre as a marking point in the lottery, according to Rav Sheishes, it must be that they were wearing that garb, and the Gemara suggested an alternative explanation for that. Tom, will Nina send out some announcements prior to the start of the classes? Yes, she's going to be right here in this seat, and she'll share it out into the forum, and it's just she'll teach her class at the same time. It really worked out well. She was preparing to do it anyway, and now that I'm going to be visiting my parents for a few days, that's a perfect opportunity for her to teach her classes. So it'll be the same format as it were in terms of her sitting here facing this camera, this light, and going out to YouTube and Facebook with God's help, right? Whenever we talk about the future, we add Bezras Hashem, right? With God's help. Okay, that is what I've got for us at this point. May we be blessed to keep growing in wisdom every day, and the things that we don't understand, may we have faith in God that He's got this, right? God has got this. He's got control of the world. Sometimes it's tough. It's tough to understand, but we're only here for a short time. We come from the world of souls. We are eternal beings. So even if we can't understand it in this world, there will be time for us to understand what was going on in this place. Have a great night.